being unsafe as a girl, I really changed the way I dressed. I had disturbed sleep. Long story short, that rocked my foundation as a secure little girl. And later, when a girl made a pass at me, I realized instead of feeling terrified, that this felt like I was in control. And so that essentially laid the seeds of lesbianism into my future.
The reality that I needed to be reconciled to my own gender in a way that I felt safe with them, in a way where this group of Christian men, like I'd had some good mentors prior to that, but these individual connections, and I think it kind of paved the way for me to actually be able to be in a group of men who didn't deal with the same things, struggle with the same things I did, same-sex attraction, that kind of thing, but to be able to receive from them.
I was asking all these questions. And I was beginning to hunt for truth now. In the middle of my emotions leading me this way, culture leading me the same direction, and friends totally fine with me going towards homosexuality, and me now being okay with it. And yet I was asking questions about what is truth? Who is God? Who does Jesus say he is? Do you identify yourself as a gay person or a person who deals with same-sex attraction or homosexual desire? That is an essential difference that will either lock you into the persona.
Yes, by embracing an identity.
Cementing. By embracing that as who you are.
Yes. As opposed to something I struggle with.
Yes, as opposed to something that's part of your life that it's not your totality, it's not your most important feature, it's not the thing that you identify by, but that you have in your life.
Well, hey, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. Whether you're joining us as somebody who's been following us through Love and Truth Network, or if you're joining through Transforming Congregations, we want to say welcome. And I'm excited, as every episode I am, for you to meet some of my wonderful friends and some of the movers and shakers in the movement for really revealing what the scriptures teach about human sexuality, about gender identity issues, and really speaking from a biblical perspective, both in terms of the truth of scripture, but also the genuine love and the value that the scriptures have for us as men and women made in the image of God, as young people, girls and boys made in the image of God. And so I'm especially excited for the conversation you're going to be joining us for today with my dear friend, Anne Edward. You might remember her by the name Anne Paulk. Her name, though, has been changed back to Anne Edward. She runs Restored Hope Network and has been the executive director of that organization from its founding. And she's here with us today. We are again at the American Association of Christian Counselors Conference. So I've been excited to be able to grab some friends here and have them sit down for us for various episodes throughout the several days that we're here. So again, glad that you can join us. And thanks so much for being here with us.
What a delight to be here with you, Garry. It's really fun.
It is fun.
I've loved running into you, and we've spent so much time on the board too, and that was really fun when you're on the board. Sometime.
Yes.
I hope you serve again.
I know. I hope so too. I would like to do that again. And we've had a lot of fun. I think especially in serving on the board, the annual retreats that we've done with the board and just taking several days away. There's been so much, I think, deep and productive ministry work that's come out of those times, but it has also been a rip-roaring fun time to be with brothers and sisters in Christ around some of these issues and just enjoying Christ in each one of us, really.
That's right. Yeah. Right. And humor. I think God's the God of humor as well.
Absolutely.
He loves funny little things. He made ostriches, for example. So, come on.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Well, and where we usually start off with our podcast is we just ask people to just share like their God story, the kind of where they were before meeting Jesus, what they've been wrestling with, what they have wrestled with, and how Jesus has met with them.
Yeah.
So
you bet.
Whether that's 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 15, whatever, just share a little bit of your story with those that are watching or listening to us today.
Sure. I was the youngest of four, and I was, at 3 years old, violated by a teenage boy in my neighborhood. This boy had exposed himself to other girls in the neighborhood, so it wasn't unheard of, but unfortunately, I was vulnerable, and the person took advantage of that. And so what happened overnight in my little soul as a little girl was I was told if I told parents that I would get in trouble, right? And that I just felt shame. I felt like I hadn't felt a sense of, whoa, something really wrong happened here, and there's something really wrong about what I did, and I don't know what it is. And I just turned into a tomboy overnight. Being a girl felt unsafe, and all this stuff all happened. And nobody told me to feel those feelings; they just happened. And it wasn't until later in my 20s when I was sharing with my mom what had happened that she shared with me more about what that person had been involved with and what had been done. The guy had even been taken to had a judge had worked with him as well. So anyhow, this really happened. Yes, it did. And overnight, being unsafe as a girl, I really changed the way I dressed. I had disturbed sleep. I had, etc. Anyway, long story short, that rocked my foundation as a secure little girl. And later, when a girl made a pass at me, I realized instead of feeling terrified, that this felt like I was in control. And so that essentially laid the seeds of lesbianism into my future.
And about how old were you at that point that
about
that happened?
6, so I was double the age.
Yep.
Yeah. And I, of course, was older and I could control more of the situation. So that really laid the foundation for me later to struggle with that even more so. So I went through high school, tried to fit in, dated guys, but everything wasn't working right. My emotions didn't match with my romantic desire, and my behavior was not solving that. And I found myself attracted to girls who were my high school friends, a couple of them, not all of them. People have the common misconception if they deal with homosexuality that somehow you're attracted to every woman or every man. And that's
I've
not
had to
true.
tell some guys, you know what, you're really safe. Like it's really okay.
Yeah, it's not, not the issue here.
Right.
Yeah, but that's just the situation happened, but I'd read the Bible. And so I told my one girlfriend who made a pass back that I'm like, actually, I think I'd like melt into a pile of salt if I did this. So I can't go there. So I went away to college and I still hadn't encountered God. I didn't necessarily believe that he existed. I just had read something that brought some degree of conviction to my heart and caused me to take a different action.
So no church background.
Nominal Christianity.
Got it.
Not really committed.
Yep.
Just appearance of commitment.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I hadn't encountered God. I didn't really know. He hadn't made himself known to me yet. I go away to college. I embrace homosexuality. I'm like, evolution makes more sense. My feelings are here. God hasn't shown up. I'm going to go with the feelings.
Yeah.
So I went with the feelings, but I began having dreams about Jesus. It was like really inconvenient.
Right.
Just saying.
Yep.
I was away at college being crazy and having dreams about Jesus. And I was like, I'd tell my friends who were mostly Jewish because my roommate was Jewish. I'd say, what do I do about this? And they're like, we don't believe in Jesus.
Right.
And,
Why are you asking
us? But they were my friends. So it was just a funny, comedic, looking back, it's hysterical. And then I got involved. I was asking all these questions and I was beginning to hunt for truth now. In the middle of my emotions leading me this way, culture leading me the same direction, and friends totally fine with me going towards homosexuality, and me now being okay with it. And yet I was asking questions about what is truth? Who is God? Who does Jesus say he is? I mean, those things don't really lead to feeling comfortable about homosexuality. So none of my friends could answer the questions. They were of all different denominational backgrounds. So I ended up at this campus group called Campus Ambassadors. It's a Baptist group. And they were having a classes called evangelism training, short for E.T., the movie that was out then. So I, as a non-believer, lesbian, was attending evangelism training classes.
You're right. This does get better. Yeah.
It's like, what in the world?
Yeah.
It's just humor left and right? Anyway, the end of those meetings, they were answering questions I was asking. It was great. And they weren't telling me all the answers. They were provoking questions that brought us to solid answers. And the final meeting, he's like, I think we just need to put a pause on all this and just pray. And so everybody's praying. I'm like, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I bowed my head and I was holding my hands like my mom had taught me when I was a little bitty girl.
Right.
And God showed me that he was in the room. He was in the room. And his character was, and he showed me two distinct things about himself. He was full of authority, but he was full of kindness. And I thought, oh my gosh, full of power and yet full of mercy.
Right.
And that blew me away. And so that began, I want to have this person in my life where I knew I was in the gap. There was no presence of God in my little place where I was sitting or the body I'm living in. And he was weaving in and out of the saints, prayers of the saints. And I was like, I don't know what's going on here. I know God's in the room. He's real. And he's this. And he's not me. So that night I did pray to receive Jesus. Later on in my room, the pastor shared with me how to do that. And hey, I'm a lesbian. So what do I do about that? And he's like, well, God, the Bible calls that sin. And so you have to be ready to relinquish that in order to embrace God and forgiveness. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if I'm ready to do that. But it was a couple of hours later and I was. And then everything changed from there. I was filled with joy. In about 6 months, I had no homosexual desire. 6 months.
Wow.
It wasn't the rest of my life.
Yep.
I'm now 40 years older.
Yep.
And, but nothing else could fill that because the joy squished out every other thing.
Yeah.
And feeling loved and forgiven and washed clean was magnificent. Yeah. But after 6 months, I began to desire a best friend, which led me to, and other girls began to try and draw me back in the life and things like that. And so I had to encounter temptation. And when I did that, I had to learn what to do with it. Am I going to just go with it? Or am I now, going to have some different choices? This one gal who was a Christian who dealt with same-sex attraction, and I had been very drawn to, especially the Jesus in her. I'd been sexually drawn to her too, though. I wanted a romantic relationship with her. Now I'm born again, and now she's pursuing me. I'm like, okay, that's a tough one. But I remember being on the beach, and she was, pulling out all the stops, and something could have happened. But I remember going, well, I can't do this to my father. He just cleansed me from all this stuff. I feel like I would be breaking God's heart. And so I told her that out loud and said, I can't go there with you because this is who I am now. Now, that was not the end of temptation, but we picked up the blankets and that was done that evening. Yep. So it was like, no, I really am different.
You won a victory, a huge victory.
Huge.
In that moment.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, it was like the biggest challenge of my life right then. Over time, I did want a best friend, not just a bunch of friends.
Right.
I wanted a best friend.
Right. Yes.
And for those of us coming out of homosexuality, especially lesbianism, that can lead to sexually acting out. For me, the first best friend didn't, the second did. And it was then that I realized, you know what? I need a lot more help than simply Bible study, praying, and talking to people about this. I need more. There's something else in my soul that's driving me this direction that I don't understand. And so I found help with a counselor and I found help with the local ministry. Frank and Anita Worthen brought me into their ministry.
Yes.
And they saw the potential of leadership in me and said, hey, we'd like you to lead things. I said, absolutely not. I'm here. I have to grow. I don't know what in the world's leading me to feel these feelings or how, if it's even possible to leave them behind. I just need to experience growth. So in that next year, and this was like 5 years into my walking with Jesus, that I had the stumble and then the now real opportunity to grow. And at that point, that place of humility and I was dealing with shame. I was dealing with humiliation, but I was in a place of I'm ready to learn. So that was really important. Like, show me what I'm missing and help me walk in this. And a bunch of things began to change in my character. One was God called me out and said, forgive the guy who violated you when you were young.
Wow.
And I said, in my mind, are you joking? That's unjust. Unless you forgive from your heart, neither will I forgive you. It was 5 years down the road when I was given that challenge by God. And my answer was, I can't change my heart. You're going to have to do it. And he took me up on that challenge. 2 weeks later, I was talking to this person on the phone. And my heart jumped with joy. And I thought, oh my gosh, you did it. You did it. You gave me the ability to forgive him.
Yes. Wow.
It's way beyond me. You did it.
Yes.
You knew I couldn't do it. I finally admitted I couldn't do it.
But you gave him the invitation.
Yeah. I gave him opportunity and I said, go for it.
Yes.
And he did it. So that was one huge thing, because that was one of the underlying things that broke my sense of well-being as a girl.
Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
The next thing was essentially, and you belong with other women. Belong, meaning I fit alongside other gals, not sexually, but I just fit in that community.
Yes.
I'm another woman amongst other women. And that really was a big light bulb moment for me. Yeah, you'd think, oh, that's obvious.
No, but those are important.
The heart
yes.
thing? Huge. If I'm just like every other woman, what's intriguing about them? Not a whole lot.
Right. It's so true.
Like, oh, we have way more in common than the fellow next to me has in common with me. Whereas they'd been my buddy group, men, and women had been the alternate, I don't really fit with you. But God established me amongst other women. And the women in my church made that possible too. They came alongside of me. They put their arm around me and they said, oh, Anne, people think we're sisters. And I'm like, well, we are spiritually sisters. Oh, they think we look alike. I am so blessed by that, says this beautiful stewardess. At the time, it was called that. Airline attendant. They're gorgeous, right? And she was like a big sister to me. She wrapped her arms around me and said, I feel so privileged that they think I look like you. I'm like, you're joking.
That's sweet. Yeah.
But they sewed into my life.
Yes.
And as a result, I felt better and better about myself also as a woman. So the pain was removed. The identity was now melding with other women. Oh, I belong amongst you. That's not appealing to sexualize something I belong amongst. Oh, men are really different. So all these internal changes were happening, and it wasn't overnight. It was over years.
Yes.
I'm consolidating it so I can share with you, right?
That's right.
But over time, I noticed that men were really different, and I'd better hug them differently than I had in the past. Oh, no wonder why guys are now, they've always wanted to date me. Oh, I get it. It took, puberty age 24.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's what it felt
to
like.
realize, right?
Like, oh, there are these worlds. And men are all bad. Where I'd believed that because of the earlier molestation. I didn't even know I believed that until I was at an Exodus conference and I was walking late into an evening session. It was dark out and I had been stalled by somebody else. Anyway, I was walking in alone and behind me, I heard a man footsteps alone walking behind me. And I'm like, it it hit the panic button in me. Oh my gosh, is this person going to try and overtake me, overpower me, and rape me? That's immediately where my fears went.
Right.
And I'm like, calm down, step aside, let the guy pass, and then you'll have peace as you keep walking. It's unlikely he's going to try and rape you. And especially if he knows that, you're not in as a vulnerable position. You can fight. So I went ahead and pulled off to the side. It turned out it was a Christian man who was there, and he recognized me. He was from a different ministry in the northern Pacific region. And he said, "Oh," and he knew my leader. "Come on, come walk, let's walk together. We'll go into the session together." And I felt protected instead of potentially violated. And I'm like, oh, not every guy's out to get me.
Right. Which is just a visceral subconscious reaction to what happened to you when you were a little girl, right? Yeah.
So though I'd begun the forgiveness process, I still had the fear response.
Sure.
And then he led a group of men. So he said, "Come sit with us." I'm like, okay, but my group's over there. But all right, I'll sit with you. And I was surrounded by a bunch of ex-gay men who were leaving homosexuality, who felt like a strong tower around me. Their masculine voices were worshiping God. Their hearts were on him. And there was this lone woman in their midst, and I felt safe and protected. And the conclusion rose in my heart was, not all men are unsafe. And so when I noticed that men were different, and I fit with women, but oh my gosh, what does make them tick? All these pieces started fitting into place, and I became open to the potential of dating and marriage over the long haul.
Yeah.
And I did end up getting married and have 3 sons that I got to raise past the ages where I'd been violated.
Oh, that's amazing.
And my fear kicked in there too. And I had to walk through layers and layers that were for my well-being and for my growth and for their best.
And how old are your boys now?
26, 23, and 20.
That's amazing. Yep.
And they're doing well.
Yes, it's so good.
They know their mama loves them. And I didn't smush their masculinity. Each one of them is doing something different. The oldest he wants to be in a band. He's got his band. He has an indie band. The middle guy's in construction and business management.
Wow.
Good for him.
Yep.
He loves building things. He loves working with his hands.
Yeah, that's
He's
great.
in there. The youngest is an auto mechanic. He hates building. He loves working on cars.
That's awesome.
He wanted to own a Lamborghini at 3 years old.
That's great.
Here's your Matchbox car,
Exactly.
son.
Yep.
You can afford this. Yeah. Maybe a light bulb. But yeah, they're each different, and it's refined me as a woman, helping to rear them, love on them, encourage them, strengthen them, see their giftings and their nature, and bless what is good and refine what it needs help.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, and you bring up some points that or some things that kind of spark in me a little bit. I want to follow up with you on the idea, like you mentioned about going through puberty at 24. I mean, in a sense, emotionally, right?
Yeah.
And I so relate to that idea. And also the reality that I needed to be reconciled to my own gender in a way that I felt safe with them, in a way where there was a group of men. It was I was 35 though, not 24. And
praise God, it happened.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
And this group of Christian men, like I'd had some good mentors prior to that, but these individual connections, and I think it kind of paved the way for me to actually be able to be in a group of men who didn't deal with the same things, struggle with the same things I did, same-sex attraction, that kind of thing, but to be able to receive from them, and I was nervous in the beginning, scared to death in the beginning. And yet over the course of time, they began to love me, care about me, and really welcome me into this company of men. And I look back on that, similar to what you mentioned at 24. And I think, God is so good to give us those opportunities. And what I become pretty firm believer in is that these normal stages of development that God intends to happen in our youth, in our developmental time during in our growing up years. I think many times because of trauma, because of various events, we can kind of get robbed of those normal courses of opportunities as young people. But I do believe that we need those opportunities to really enter fully into a more whole sense of our adulthood.
Yes.
And so God, whether it's 20 or it's in our 30s, and sometimes I think even
Later
older,
yeah.
He will bring those opportunities around again for us to experience, to be able to become whole enough. I don't think we just get by them. It's like, well, you missed the opportunity and somehow God's just going to drop it on, all the good things that you need. I think experientially, He provides something that can fill in those gaps again. What are your thoughts about that?
I love your comments. I totally agree. And God's heart is for us.
Yes.
He wants us to thrive, and He wants us to grow into the man or woman that He intended all along. And so He's always after restoration and redemption. So I love what you said. I think it's necessary, but I think also the heart condition when the opportunity arises matters a lot. Like, I was in a place of saying, well, I failed on my own. I've tried all the, ordinary steps. Okay, teach me, Lord. My heart is open, and I understand that I don't have it all. And so this kind of posture of humility, a posture of being a learner in His part and learning from others.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of things that we've learned that we love to share with others. Probably the main reason why you're doing the podcast.
Right, exactly. It is.
And so some people will hear that and go, well, that's fine for you, but I'm not going to put myself in that position. It's too risky. How would you, as host, answer that for men?
The idea of something being too risky
of risk.
Yeah.
Risk to allow others into that place of influence.
Yep. Well, and honestly, the phrase that I think it's Dr. Phil that kind of coined the phrase, how's that working for you? And not to be in any way snarky, and I don't think he's intending to be snarky, but he's bringing the reality down to, okay, you're unwilling to go here, but ultimately over time, how is that actually working? Like,
yes.
And I had to wrestle with that. I mean, there were so many times, like, I love what you just said about being willing for God to bring that intervention, because there were so many opportunities where I could kind of get off my merry-go-round of this miserable cycles of addiction, cycles of emotional
that has a temporary high, and then more brokenness to come after that.
And that opportunity would come about, and I would not get off. I would not choose His path, and so I was kind of stuck in that place again. But He would bring about another opportunity, and finally, it was at a point where I could see it more clearly, and also where my heart was more tender toward Him. And I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to exit, and I'm going to take God's path here. And so part of it was beginning to recognize that it doesn't make sense. The definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I was living that out in spades. And so it was really coming to a place of, look, I'm exhausted, and I've been doing this all on my own and trying to work this out. I haven't really trusted God. Maybe God's different than what I've concluded He is.
Right.
And so it was really it began really with a question of maybe He is different. Maybe the perceptions I have about men, about women, about life in general, about people, about God, about myself, maybe those things are off. And of course, it sounds so dumb to sort of verbalize that now, because obviously they were way off. But in my life, I'm living so close to this situation, I couldn't see it.
Right.
So for men or women wrestling, because so much of what you've described is, like, for me, I needed to be around other men, not just around girlfriends that I felt more comfortable with, right? And so I think that we do get to a point in God's mercy where He allows us to feel pretty miserable apart from Him. He allows us to go down this downward spiral, but always extending this invitation, always. I said to someone yesterday in one of the podcasts, but I'm going to repeat it again. I feel like God, for years had been like a fisherman in my life, where I had bit the hook, but God wasn't just like yanking me into the shore, because, when I fished before, there's times that the fish has gotten off the line because I pulled too. Yeah. Because I've told, so He just let me swim and exhaust myself for a number of years, honestly, until I finally came to a point of saying, okay, I'm ready. And honestly, I was angry throughout that whole time with God. But when I came to the end of myself, I was so grateful for the way that he hadn't rejected me. Ultimately, he had been with me through all of this, not celebrating, not approving anything I was doing, not the stuff that I was doing, but yet waiting and abiding the right time for my heart to be soft, to be able to turn to him. So
Right.
I think that piece of surrender is so critical.
I think it is. And I think it's important to note for everybody else is, although Gary's married and I was married for 21 years and have 3 sons, my life as a single person was honoring to him as well.
Yes.
By the time I was noticing men were different and my heart was engaging there, it could have been like many of my friends. Great, we've gone as far as we can, and I'm, content to honor God in my singleness. And I admire a number of friends who've had that. I have the privilege of potentially having grandchildren at some point, right? That some other people are missing out on, but they could have additional relationships in their life that add in family members, where adoptive family members, spiritual family members, where those are opportunities. So life is not all barren apart from marriage either. And there are challenges in marriage that can either refine us or break us. And several came near to both.
Yep. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've often said, when it comes to that point, I want you to pick up on this, but I've often said when I was a pastor doing premarital counseling,
right.
Or even talking with people that were considering that or longing for marriage. And that's a good thing to long
it's
for.
It's a good longing, but God put it in our hearts.
I tell people all the time, it's so much better to be single wishing you were married than married wishing you were single.
I know. Wow.
And so
that's a good point.
That doesn't solve it. And for everybody, I'm not saying that, but man, I know some people that are in their marriages that got into marriage probably for a lot of the wrong reasons.
Right.
And they're pretty darn miserable. And there's, I just think that there's so much more freedom to be in that space of desiring something and waiting for God to bring it if he desires it for us. But in the meantime, just as you said, that meaningful service, that joyful involvement in genuine kingdom purpose and really I became a spiritual father before I was ever married, which is shocking. I mean, it is amazing.
Isn't that awesome of God?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I love that.
Beautiful.
But what were you were saying something else, I think, about marriage when I kind of interjected. Did I throw you off there entirely? Probably.
I'm sure I was saying something else, but it's gone.
No, that's all right.
It's fine. I'm sure it wasn't that important.
No, if it comes back around, you can mention it.
But no.
The other thing I wanted to, so you and I actually, again, served, we were kind of laughing about this in the beginning, but got to serve on the board together, and Restored Hope Network really came out of, was established before Exodus International closed down, maybe 2 or 3 years before. And, but
almost exactly 1 year.
Oh, was
before.
it 1 year?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I'm so grateful as one who was a part of Exodus International. And one of the things I talk with churches about, and many people about, who have heard about Exodus, but have never really experienced them. But often many people have negative associations with Exodus because of things that they've heard, not things that they've experienced usually. And so I can go back and say, look, I was there for 10 years at these summer conferences, and I was the Northeast Regional Coordinator, and my wife was on the board. You've been on the board.
I've been on the board of Exodus.
Was a lifeline for so many of us. Can you share a little bit about that?
It also means it wasn't perfect.
No,
but that doesn't mean the general direction and general help was amazing.
Right.
I mean, yeah. So going to the conferences, my first one was in 1989.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Davies was the president of it. Bob was a tender-hearted man with a great conference team, and it was a lifeline. Amazing things happened in my life as a result. And all the work in between the conferences that I was engaged in, the ministry, being part of the other ministry and doing discipleship throughout the year. I recognized when I came to the conference that I was different the following year because of all the hard work that we'd done prior. But the opportunity to hear great topics, to hear another angle that you might not hear at your home church, affiliate with people who actually were moving ahead. I remember one gal, she was the board secretary on the board of Exodus. And I was so in awe of the fact that she was Really? She was from the gay background? Are you joking? She used to be, what? You know, and young children and married to her husband, and they love each other so much, and just ordinary people that you'd never guess came from that.
Right.
And so I saw more and more of that, and I thought, oh, maybe the possibilities are there of future for me in different ways than I'd expect. Made fast friends there as well. And it was always like old home week.
Yes. I agree.
Worship,
yes.
too.
The worship has always been some of the best I've ever been in at the Exodus conferences. Yeah. People crying out to the Lord.
Yes. And everybody hungry for him. The worship leaders never had to say, okay, everybody raise your hands or anything.
Right. No,
they're just going to go all in for Jesus,
Yep.
you know, in worship. So it was always a delight for worship leaders to come and lead us because they found hungry hearts waiting and knowing redemption and the cost that he'd paid was so beautiful and amazing. So the other thing, though, that I found was, you know, there were people that were going for other reasons.
Sure.
And some of those folks would try and pick up on people, or sometimes some of the conference, you know, but some of the content wasn't perfect.
Sure. Right.
But you know what? It was really good. If I could characterize it as where on that spectrum, I'd say like an 8. I would think it was very good. So yeah, I don't have regret about being involved in Exodus. It was a lifeline to not just me, not just you, but a whole thousands of others.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And they were shocked when they closed with an apology. The people who'd been helped by Exodus.
Right.
In fact, they were thrown so much that they were doubting their own walk with Jesus after living for him for 20 years.
Yes. Yeah.
It was a devastating moment for many of us.
Yep. Well, and I'm so grateful that you and Andrew Comiskey and David Cal Foster, Stephen Black, I mean, others rose up to recognize, look, first of all, we have to leave, sadly, Exodus. And I went through that process as well after writing to the board and talking with the executive director. But you guys, I came into it after the team had been formed. I think I was there maybe a year after RHN started, and just as a participant, as a member. But I'm so grateful that there was the vision there. And of course, Frank Worthen was of course involved too, right?
He was. He helped found Exodus. Now he helped found Restored Hope.
So good. Yeah.
And Andrew, and we talked to many others.
Right.
So yeah. There's about 300 years worth of experience in ministry of all the signers at the bottom of the letter that sent it into the Exodus office and executive director and board about, if you'd fix these things, we could stay with you. And if not, we can't stay with you. And they disregarded all of that. That's pretty serious.
Yeah, no, it is for sure. But the fact that now how many members? Here we are. Restored Hope Network has about how many members
about
now?
52, 54.
Okay. Yeah.
A lot more counselors are affiliating with us now. They see the challenges in culture, but they're willing to say, no, this is where we believe God can change lives. We're going to come alongside of Restored Hope. So we've had about 10 affiliations recently that we're in the process with. Half of those are counselors all throughout the U.S. and some places where it's illegal to help minors, for example. Yeah. And here are counselors who are putting they're in the middle of their practices. They're not retired. They're putting their livelihood on the line and saying, I will help. Currently, we advise people who are in places where it's illegal to either challenge the law as join with ADF and say, is this legal for you to infringe upon our rights as a counselor?
Yep.
So those kind of lawsuits have been happening. Also, you can treat anxiety, depression in somebody who's dealing with LGBT without saying, hey, I'm helping you leave LGBT topics. I'm just going to help you deal with any crisis or trauma that's underneath. I'm going to help you in relationship skills. I'm going to help you deal with anxiety or depression. And if perchance there's a root underneath that has to do with trauma that also leads to discomfort with your gender or sexualizing the gender, and we just happen to touch on that, hey, I wasn't going for that, but hey, I'm going to help you in the areas where I can. So we have a number of counselors who have joined us from states where that's the tack they have to take.
And you have a number of ministries around the country. For example, Love and Truth Network and Transforming Congregations. Our ministries are members of Restored Hope Network as well.
Which also has a religious element of protections as far as legally, but also the breadth of understanding and experience and pastoral care and speaking. And Garry, you bring a lot to the table from your position of having experienced a lot, having a counselor as a wife, seriously, you've got a lot that you bring to the table with Love and Truth. Networking is a huge gift of yours. Teaching congregations how to address sexual integrity issues, huge. Those are big. So I'm so grateful for you.
Well, thank you, Anne.
So
I do appreciate that. Yeah, I do very much. What would you want to say to anyone, listening, watching this podcast who themselves are struggling? Like you mentioned earlier, the perspective, and I hear this a lot. Well, that's fine for you. Or maybe the more common phrase we hear a lot is, well, that's your truth, and I have my truth, which of course I believe there's one truth, there's God's truth basically. But what would you say to someone who may be in that place watching or listening who feels like, wow, well, I'm glad that worked for you. I wish that could work for me. I have serious doubts though.
Well, I think having a questioning heart, having an open heart of like, well, okay, that worked for you. My experience may not be that other person's experience.
Exactly.
They may not get married and divorced, mind you, because the ex went back in the gay lifestyle, right? I, from a gay background, did not. A whole lot of men do not also. So what I would say is, it's really important to go, okay, well, Lord, what is it you have for me? If you're a Christian, why don't you involve God in the process? And ask him essential questions like, who am I really? Jesus, I want to hear from you, who you say I am. I want to know who you say you are. I want to relate in the way you say is the right way to relate to people. And just opening up the conversation with God and with others who it can encourage. I think one essential thing that holds people back from future possibilities for them, walking faithfully as a single person who's not gay identified because they're not having struggles with that moment by moment, day by day, like I used to have, is, do you identify yourself as a gay person or a person who deals with same-sex attraction or homosexual desire or gay desire? That is an essential difference that will either lock you into the persona.
Yes. By embracing an identity.
Cementing. By embracing that as who you are.
Yes. Or, as opposed to something I struggle with.
Yes. As opposed to something that's part of your life that it's not your totality. It's not your most important feature. It's not the thing that you identify by, but that you have in your life.
Like any other scenario.
You're willing to bring that before God and man. Scripture becomes super applicable when you no longer call yourself a gay man or a gay woman, lesbian woman. And so identity is a huge piece to the puzzle, but there are 4 basic pieces. Feelings, of course, having the struggle, desire to meld with somebody of your same sex, and the longing romantically to do that. Behavior is another big one. Another big one is identity that we just talked about. And then ideology. Our culture is sending messages en masse that may or may not be true. And anything that's true will stand tests and shouldn't be worried about being challenged.
Right.
Right?
Right. Or canceled.
God's not fragile. You can ask him anything. You can, hey, I disagree on this, but show me. He's good with that. But I'll tell you what, LGBT ideology is not good with. It's fragile, which points to the fact it can't be challenged. It's almost breakable. It's almost like super fragile glass that if you have any challenge to it,
you're canceled.
You are canceled. Mm-hmm. You have this reflexive emotional response against anybody who asks any questions about it. And so test God versus your ideology and see what's more fragile. And, I'd say lean into what stands the test of time. What's stable, what's secure, what does he have to say about it? What does he think about you? And I know already the answer to that is he loves the person who struggles.
Yes.
I know that.
Yep.
Shadow of a doubt. No shadow of a doubt.
But somebody who's listening to this, and I love everything you said about that in response to my question. Another thing that occurred to me, though, as you're talking, is that all of those things are true. But I think also one of the things that locked me into that locked me into a place of where I wasn't as open is that I made a lot of assumptions about God. And I had really solidified some ideas about how, like, when you're saying God loves you, there would have been a time in my life, like, well, what does love mean? But also, I would be even irritated to hear someone say God loved me. Like, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, I don't think he does. What do you mean? He might love you and he might love these other people, but I don't feel like he loves me.
Oh yeah, he wants to wrap his arms around you.
Absolutely. But the assumption, can be based, right? But based on our experiences and how we've interpreted those experiences, oftentimes we feel like God is against us. I know I did at one time. And so for the person watching or hearing this, just to have that directly addressed, our assumptions about God, our perceptions about him can really solidify us. And I loved what you said about that idea of asking questions and honestly being curious. Be willing to be more curious than just locking God into this box of mine, this box of yours that would define him a certain way. Be curious enough and willing enough for him to really show you who he is. I think is very important, along with our own sense of personal identity. One of the last things I wanted to mention, you were sharing about that story that happened at Exodus about that guy walking behind you and how it reminded me of a time, one of the many times that I was at the Exodus conference, and I had some friends there through Regeneration Ministries out of Baltimore, and it had a couple of leaders that were friends there. And I worked with the bookstore quite a bit when they would set up bookstores for for that week or that 5 days or what have you. And I was out walking in the evening with a buddy, a guy friend of mine, and these two women, and there was and we're walking on the sidewalk, and there was a guy coming toward us that just looked kind of
shady, a little bit,
a little sketchy, a little shady, a little concerning, and I had happened to be walking to one side of the woman, one of these women friends. And this was an older woman, and I just reached up and I just kind of took her elbow and moved her across in front of me. So I was then in a place where I was on the other side of her and I would be closest to this guy.
Nice.
And it wasn't something I even thought about. I wasn't that conscious of what I was doing. I saw him and I just reacted reflexively to that and never thought another thing about it. And then when, after the conference was over, I was heading home and driving, and I got a call on my cell phone, and I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it, and it was her husband, who had not been at the conference, but she had told him about what I did in that situation. And he called me to say, Garry, you don't know who I am yet, but I'm Natalie's husband. And I just want you to know that Natalie just told me about that experience. And I want you to know how much I appreciate the fact that you were protective of my wife, And
that's true masculinity.
Yes. And
according to God.
But how wonderful. This is just an example of how a man who didn't wrestle with the things I wrestled with same-sex attraction, those kinds of things, in a very fatherly way. But he didn't have to call me. He didn't have to say anything at all. But I remember that. And it was so uplifting to hear another man thank me for stepping into this masculine place of covering and protection. And I don't know, it's those, I'm just simply saying it, that there's so many ways when Hebrews says, encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called today, so that your hearts are not hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. I think we could do a lot better job within the church, within female friendships, but certainly within male friendships, of not just, we love sarcasm. We love to there's a way
silly.
Silly. And there's a level of sarcasm that's fun, that's not mocking, that's not ripping at the other person. But I think that so many times we would benefit so much more if we could genuinely express value and appreciation for the person, for one another. And anyway, that built me up. That encouraged me in such a deep way. And those were that's just one little tiny experience that happened in many different ways throughout that week and throughout the course of years of time through those Exodus conferences. And I look at my time at Exodus as being a season of my life where God helped me break patterns of sin and addiction. And I'm so grateful for that. But it was a number of years later, even after coming on staff at a church that knew my story and I shared all of that, I got involved then in Living Waters Desert Stream.
Great.
And I feel like that involvement with Andrew Comiskey and Desert Stream and Living Waters,
it's a whole other level, isn't it?
It was a whole other level.
Yeah.
And it took me from simply not acting out to understanding that there was this whole open world that God had for me to be involved in eternal value. Like I get to sow into the kingdom. I get to be a spiritual father. You get to be a spiritual mom. We get to be older brothers, older sister, whatever, to others that are wrestling and struggling or just living life. And our gift, our walking alongside of actually has the potential for such massive eternal value in people's lives. And just to bring it full circle, like with this kid that abused you when you were 3 years old, and it also abused so many others. I mean, the ripple effect of his sin, the ripple effect of his brokenness, and then the ripple effect of how he hadn't even been stopped. We either have the ability to pour into people's lives in a kingdom way, an eternal way that lifts up and empowers and strengthens for eternal value and purpose, or we're involved, I think, in this decay, either trauma in people's lives or this worthless decay, right? We kind of live the cradle to the grave, not really accomplishing much of anything. And I want to be about kingdom purposes, and I know you do too.
I sure do. I sure do. And so it's such a privilege to serve in this ministry. It's such a privilege to share what I've been given.
Yes.
And I'm sure that's the same for you.
Very much so.
It's a privilege to have a front row seat to seeing what God's up to and how he uses his people who trust him with the things that they've been given in their own lives and sow into other people. And honestly, it's addictive. In the best sense.
In the best way, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thanks, Anne, for sharing with us.
May I say?
Better than chocolate. All right. Well, thanks for sharing with us. Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule. So, hey, for everybody watching, listening to this podcast, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in a future episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We so appreciate the time you've just invested with us in our Transforming Congregations podcast. To join us for future podcasts, dial into transformingcongregations.org/podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in a future podcast.